The freezing waters of the Atlantic had already swallowed the lower decks. The clock struck exactly 2:05 a.m. The floor beneath the feet of the world's richest men tilted at a terrifying angle, shattering any lingering illusion of safety. Where soft music and champagne toasts once filled the air, only desperate screams and the agonizing groan of tearing metal remained. Today, we're going to reconstruct the final 15 minutes of the Titanic through the eyes of first class. The exact moment when all the money in the world became absolutely worthless. But before we dive into that fateful night, drop a like, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments what time you're watching this. I want to know when our audience tunes in for these deep dives. When the Titanic's massive engines stopped vibrating on that freezing night, the elite's immediate reaction wasn't panic. It was a deep, arrogant disbelief. For first-class passengers, tucked away in heated suites, paneled in rich mahogany, the very idea that this marvel of engineering could sink was a joke. For the first few hours after the collision, the vast majority flat out refused to leave the comfort of their rooms to brave the bitter cold of the upper boat deck. Men accustomed to dictating the rules of the world scoffed at the crew's warnings. High society ladies complained about the sheer inconvenience of having their sleep interrupted. After all, why trade the luxurious safety of the most formidable ship on Earth for a tiny wooden boat bobbing in the pitch-black North Atlantic? The initial mood felt like a bizarre parlor trick, with passengers picking up chunks of ice to play with, completely blind to the tragedy quietly unfolding right beneath their feet. But there was one thing money couldn't buy: time. As the water relentlessly flooded the lower decks, the sheer geometry of the ship began to betray the truth. The slant of the floor went from a mild discomfort to a terrifying slope. It was only when the last lifeboats began swinging out over the water, lit by the eerie glare of distress rockets, that the bubble of denial finally burst. The illusion of safety shattered, replaced by a crushing realization of mortality. Panic, once held in check by high society etiquette, bled through the lavish corridors. Those who had mocked the warnings just an hour ago were now sprinting frantically across Persian rugs, grasping at any shred of hope as the bow plunged deeper into the dark abyss. And it was against this backdrop of absolute chaos that the human mind revealed its darkest, most fascinating facets. Because in the midst of this madness, where the overwhelming majority fought blindly for their lives, scrambling for a seat in those final boats, a few millionaires made a choice that still defies every instinct of human survival. Instead of rushing to the deck in a desperate final bid for salvation, they turned their backs on the lifeboats. They walked right back to their rooms, and in their final minutes, they did something truly unbelievable. Stick around, because we're about to uncover exactly what that was. While those few men did the unthinkable and walked away from salvation, the upper deck of the Titanic morphed into the stage for the most brutal of human farewells. This very spot, which just days prior served as a runway for high society to flaunt their wealth in the ocean breeze, was now a tilted, chaotic nightmare, swept by a biting wind that chilled you to the bone. The myth of the unsinkable ship had utterly collapsed. The dark waters of the Atlantic swallowed the decks with a terrifying hunger, and the booming cracks of distress flares tearing through the night sky served as a cruel reminder. Against all odds, they were entirely alone in the void. Driven by a primal urge to survive, all eyes locked onto the final lifeboats. And this is where we need to focus our attention on Collapsible D, the very last boat successfully lowered from the ship's davits. The panic surrounding that small canvas craft was indescribable. Absolutely everyone there, from the most powerful Wall Street banker to the lowest-ranking crewman, knew the grim truth. These were the final guaranteed tickets to life. The math of the tragedy simply didn't add up. The crushing realization that hundreds would inevitably be left behind hung heavy in the dense midnight air. But there was one detail that made this countdown even more agonizing for first class: the age-old maritime rule of women and children first. So, what seemed, in the early hours of the sinking, like a mere protocol of British chivalry and a polite gesture expected of the elite, rapidly devolved into ruthless martial law. Officers like Charles Littler, his face drawn tight with extreme tension and his voice worn raw, actually drew their firearms to ensure no man took a woman's seat. The fine lines separating civility from outright chaos began to erase completely. The exorbitant luxury of the voyage gave way to the traumatic severing of entire families, with husbands quite literally torn from their wives amidst screams and tears. And it was in this exact moment that the true face of despair revealed itself, even to men who had spent their entire lives believing they could buy anything on earth. Take the iconic case of John Jacob Astor, the wealthiest man aboard, holding a fortune almost unfathomable for the time. Astor was traveling with his young wife, Madeline, who was 5 months pregnant. With the cool composure of a man used to calling the shots, he helped her into the lifeboat. Then, he asked the officer, almost like requesting a favor at an exclusive New York steakhouse, if he might join her, given her delicate condition. The crew's response was short, sharp, and final. No man would step foot in that boat until every woman on the ship was aboard. Astor, a man who had doors opened for him with the snap of his fingers, slammed headfirst into the insurmountable wall of his own imminent death. And contrary to what many might think, he didn't scream. He didn't make a scene, and he didn't try to write million-dollar checks to save his own skin. With a resignation that practically chills the blood, he simply stepped back. He lit a cigarette with steady hands, looked deeply into Madeline's eyes, and, with his voice heavy with a lie they both deep down knew to be true, swore he'd see her in New York come morning. That fleeting goodbye, muffled by the deafening roar of escaping steam and the wails of strangers, was the ultimate proof. Every ounce of his colossal wealth meant absolutely nothing in the face of the ocean. First class, once shielded by endless bank accounts, watched their own families be torn to pieces in those final, fleeting minutes of hope. The lifeboats lowered slowly, ropes groaning under the strain, carrying women who looked up to watch their husbands grow smaller and smaller in the dark, soon to be swallowed by the freezing water. And the brutal truth was, the second the ropes on that final boat were cut, the very last spark of hope vanished with it. What followed on that slanting deck wasn't a matter of class or money anymore. It was the total, utter collapse of every civilized rule mankind had ever invented. As the last lifeboat sliced through the black water and pulled away from the massive steel hull, a devastating, cruel reality washed over the passengers left behind. There was nowhere left to go. The countdown had hit 0. Up until that critical breaking point, the Titanic operated as a perfect bulletproof microcosm of strict Edwardian society. A floating world where the borders between the haves and have-nots were forged by heavy, padlocked iron gates and an apparently unbreakable hierarchy. But the brutal, indifferent force of nature doesn't care about bloodlines, old money surnames, or astronomical bank balances. As the freezing water relentlessly claimed deck after deck, and the stern of the ship began to rise menacingly toward the star-filled, moonless sky, social protocol crumbled just as fast as the ocean flooded those majestic boiler rooms. The boat deck, which just hours prior had been the peaceful, exclusive sanctuary of coal barons, railroad heirs, and Wall Street tycoons, abruptly became the stage for a social leveling unprecedented in modern history. For the very first time on that doomed voyage, Steerage passengers who had managed to break through the barriers of the lower decks, fighting tooth and nail through a labyrinth of flooded corridors and grated gates, emerged into the freezing night, and they came face to face with the global elite. The sheer contrast of the scene was so surreal, it defied the very logic of the era's civility. Men of the highest pedigree, still dressed to the nines in flawless tailcoats, starched collars, and even classic black silk top hats, suddenly found themselves packed shoulder to shoulder with Irish immigrants, Swedish laborers, and Lebanese families clad in rough wool, clutching their life savings tied tightly against their weeping bodies. But there was a deeply unsettling detail in this new reality, forged by impending doom. There were no more subservient maids to order a round, no more polite stewards to pour a comforting glass of brandy, and certainly no officers worried about maintaining proper decorum. The invisible armor that had shielded the first class their entire lives had completely dissolved in the biting air of the North Atlantic. These untouchable millionaires, who had spent a lifetime outsourcing physical labor and passing off the smallest daily inconveniences to their subordinates, were suddenly thrust into a brutal arena. They had to fight with their bare hands in the midst of absolute chaos, just to claw back a few more minutes of life. The most primitive of human instincts, one that doesn't recognize aristocratic titles or purchasing power, took the reins with overwhelming force. Raw, wild, unfiltered panic began to dictate the rules of that dark night. The problem was, at that critical breaking point of the sinking, even the simple act of standing upright became an exhausting, losing battle against the laws of physics. Picture the scene in your mind's eye. The wooden floor of that majestic deck, polished to perfection by sailors just hours earlier, was now dangerously slick, coated in a treacherous layer of sea mist and freezing ice. The tilt of the massive ocean liner was becoming so terrifying, so impossibly steep, that moving forward meant gripping with tooth and nail to taut ropes, the iron davits of already launched lifeboats, or anything bolted to the floor. People were slipping and sliding helplessly down the slanted deck, plunging right into the dark water that relentlessly swallowed the bow. The shouts of command, once polite and respectful, dissolved into a deafening roar of fervent prayers in a dozen different languages, deep wails, and desperate pleas for a rescue that, deep down in their souls, everyone knew wouldn't arrive in time. And it was in this exact moment, as the Titanic's colossal black stern began to physically rise from the water, like a leviathan emerging from the deep, backed by the terrifying symphony of thousands of shattering plates, heavy furniture crashing through luxurious lounges, and massive steel groaning under unimaginable pressure, that the true fragility of mankind was laid bare to the world. No lifeboats, no liveried servants, no privileges of immense wealth. With the hourglass running out of its final grains of sand, the illusion of total control finally shattered into a million pieces. But, incredibly, even in the face of this deafening apocalyptic nightmare, where the primal animal instinct to run, grab, and scream felt like the only logical response for a desperate mind, a select group of first-class men made a choice that defies human comprehension to this day. They decided they would not take part in that horrific spectacle on the open deck. They simply turned their backs on the panicked mob and walked, fighting the steep incline every step of the way, right back into the dying, exquisite heart of the ship. While an inferno of ice and panic unfolded on the upper deck, swallowing whatever shreds of civility remained among the passengers, a completely different and deeply unsettling scene was taking shape deep in the ship's belly. To truly understand the psychology of human despair in its rawest form, we have to follow those few men who simply walked away from the savage fight for survival. Leaving the biting wind, the chaos, and the agonizing screams behind, They pushed through heavy oak doors and stepped into a parallel universe. They sought refuge in a sanctuary of tranquility that seemed entirely blind to the impending apocalypse outside. The exquisite first-class smoking room. This room, strictly off-limits to anyone but the gentlemen of high society, was the true beating heart of financial power aboard the Titanic. The walls were lined with meticulously hand-carved dark mahogany. The floors boasted thick carpets that swallowed the sound of hurried footsteps, and the air still held the unmistakable rich scent of Cuban cigars blended with the heavy aroma of fine leather armchairs. Outside, the majestic ship was dying, groaning and twisting under the brutal pressure of thousands of tons of ocean water flooding her holds. But inside, under the soft, warm glow of crystal chandeliers that stubbornly refused to flicker out, the atmosphere was one of almost ghostly serenity. The chilling truth is, this apparent calm wasn't born of ignorance or denial. These elite men, sitting in sharp silence or speaking only in hushed, discreet murmurs, knew exactly that they were going to die. They had stared into the impenetrable darkness of the sea and made a conscious choice. If the end was inevitable, they would meet it not like cornered animals on a slippery deck, but exactly as they had lived, as refined gentlemen. And it was against this exact backdrop of stoic acceptance that one of the most iconic figures of the entire Titanic story met his final fate. There, in the dead center of that grand room, stood Thomas Andrews, the ship's brilliant chief designer and the man who intimately knew every single rivet of that colossal vessel. More than anyone else on board, Andrews understood the ruthless math of the sinking. From the very second he went below to assess the hull damage right after the collision, he knew with surgical precision that his masterpiece was doomed and that it would drag thousands of innocent souls to the bottom of the ocean. Consumed by an indescribable guilt and utterly exhausted from desperately trying to save lives on the decks by actively helping women and children into the lifeboats, he finally surrendered and withdrew. Witnesses reported seeing him for the last time in the smoking room, completely isolated in his dark thoughts. His life jacket, his only tangible chance at surviving just a few minutes longer in the freezing water, was tossed carelessly onto a green felt card table, discarded like a useless trinket he had already let go of. Andrews stood perfectly still, arms crossed, his eyes fixed blankly on a large painting above the marble fireplace, ironically titled "The Approach to the New World." He seemed trapped in a state of profound shock, numbed by the tragedy his creation had become. The brilliant mind of the naval architect was now locked inside the final minutes of an unstoppable nightmare. His deathly silence, contrasting with the muffled, distant booms of massive metal beams snapping in half, carries a psychological weight that fascinates historians to this day. He chose to go down with his ship not just to honor a rigid nautical code, but because there was simply no life left to live, no peace of mind to be found, after witnessing the catastrophic end of his life's work and carrying the weight of so many lost souls on his shoulders. But there was a highly curious, equally dark detail to this scene. He wasn't alone in this melancholic waiting room for death. Other millionaires, tycoons, and aristocrats filled the armchairs around him, painting a surreal, silent picture. Powerful men who could have easily fought tooth and nail for a seat in a collapsible lifeboat simply chose to light up another cigar or pour themselves another generous splash of brandy. Some accounts suggest that card games carried on with an enviable ice-cold composure, the players pretending that the terrifying slant of the deck, which was now causing glasses to slowly slide across the tables, was just a minor hiccup in their luxury crossing. That room represented the final, unshakable refuge of a dying Gilded Age. The real world outside was violently changing. But inside the smoking room, Edwardian protocol remained untouched. And this completely shatters everything we think we know about how human beings react to extreme tragedy. We are taught, from day one, to believe that the survival instinct is the universal driving force of our species, and that at the end of the line, absolutely everyone will panic to save their own skin. But the flawless composure of these titans of industry shows us the terrifying power of the human mind and social convention. For them, the absolute indignity of throwing punches in the dark, losing their composure, crying, and begging for a spot in a tiny wooden boat next to people they deemed socially inferior was a moral death infinitely worse than drowning. The material luxury they had spent their lives building had become utterly useless, but the heavy anchor of honor and social status pinned them invisibly to those leather chairs. They preferred to embrace the illusory comfort of that artificial warmth, waiting, almost with a sense of relief, for the dark, freezing waters of the Atlantic to smash through the windows, flood the exquisite room, and turn out the lights of first class once and for all. And it's exactly this same invisible force of honor that brings us full circle to the question we left hanging at the beginning of our journey. Remember those millionaires who, at the absolute peak of the chaos, swam against the tide of human instinct, turned their backs on the hope of the lifeboats, and walked right back into the belly of the dying ship? What guided these men wasn't a denial of reality, but a profound, cutting acceptance of it. When the Titanic's tilt became severe enough that anyone with eyes could see the end was just minutes away, the aristocracy had to make a definitive choice. And it was in this moment that the initial promise of our story delivers one of the most majestic, surreal, and haunting chapters of that freezing night. The protagonist of this act of pure tragic elegance was Benjamin Guggenheim, a mining magnate and heir to one of the most colossal fortunes in the United States. Guggenheim was the walking embodiment of Gilded Age luxury, a man who lived his life surrounded by the finest things the world had to offer. During the first few hours after the ship struck the iceberg, he actually tried to follow the emergency protocols, even slipping a thick wool sweater on under an uncomfortable, bulky cork life jacket. But there was a crucial detail that changed everything. Guggenheim was a deeply analytical man. As he watched the grim mathematics of the lifeboats play out and saw the primal panic beginning to grip the passengers around him on the upper deck, he instantly understood that his death warrant had already been signed by the ocean. And this completely changes what we know about the human reaction when staring into the unforgiving abyss. Instead of fighting, screaming, or stooping to beg for a seat that would fatally rob a woman or a child of their life, Guggenheim made a choice that transcends the basic logic of survival. Accompanied by his loyal valet, Victor Giglio, he abandoned the boat deck and descended the grand staircases, heading straight back to his cabin. There, in the dead silence of his quarters that would soon be underwater, the two men methodically stripped off their sweaters and life jackets. As if they were dressing for a lavish banquet in Paris, they put on their absolute finest evening wear, donning flawless tailcoats and starched shirts. When they returned to the grand lounges, a crewman begged them to try and save themselves, to which Guggenheim delivered a line that would echo through history. "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." For him, luxury had become a suit of armor to face death standing tall. But here's the thing. That visceral need to hold on to dignity in the face of the inevitable wasn't just limited to lone gentlemen with their cigars. Just a few feet away, an incredibly heartbreaking scene was unfolding around Isidore Straus, the highly respected co-owner of Macy's department store, and his wife, Ida. They were one of the wealthiest and most admired couples on board, entirely inseparable for over 4 decades. When the couple reached the lifeboats, the officer in charge, out of sheer respect for Isidore's age and standing, offered him a seat next to his wife. It was a rare exception, but the patriarch just shook his head. With an unwavering voice, he declared he wouldn't step foot in a lifeboat before any younger man. He was sticking to his moral code to the bitter end. Faced with this ironclad refusal, panic gripped the people trying to help them. Friends literally tried to force Ida into the boat. But that's the moment the power of a lifetime together proved so much stronger than the sheer terror of that freezing night. Ida Strauss took a step back. She stepped right out of the lifeboat line, looked deep into her husband's eyes, and handed her heavy fur coat to her maid. With a calm that completely silenced the frantic crowd around them, she delivered a line that would echo for eternity. "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." The two were last seen sitting side by side on a pair of deck chairs. They were holding hands tightly as the dark waters swallowed the deck. In those final agonizing minutes, the Titanic's first class proved that all the money in the world couldn't buy a single second against the wrath of nature. But for these people, their evening wear and their unbreakable love became the ultimate fortress against the dying of the light. Those displays of unshakable dignity and lifelong love had turned the sinking, lavish lounges into silent sanctuaries. But they were about to be brutally shattered by the crushing weight of nature. The clock ticked down relentlessly. Now, there were exactly 3 minutes left until the absolute end. The majestic Titanic, once the undisputed pinnacle of human engineering and luxury, was in its final moments. It was fighting a losing battle against the colossal weight of the ocean, mercilessly invading its steel guts. The deck's slant had become so extreme that walking was now physically impossible. People clung desperately to whatever they could find, dangling over a pitch-black, freezing abyss. And it was right then that the visual heart of the ship, the famous and dazzling first-class grand staircase, suffered its fatal blow. The freezing water, which had already swallowed the boat deck, began pouring violently through the skylights. It created a massive indoor waterfall that cascaded down step by step, completely destroying the exquisite hand-carved oak panels. But the colossal structure couldn't hold out for long. Under the indescribable pressure of thousands of tons of water, the magnificent ornate glass dome gave way with a terrifying crash. It imploded, sweeping hundreds of people away at once in a violent, unstoppable torrent. The absolute epitome of luxury was instantly shredded by the fury of the North Atlantic. But there was an even more terrifying detail in this tragic countdown. Something that kept a fragile flicker of hope alive, even in the face of indescribable chaos. The lights. Thanks to the invisible, heroic sacrifice of the engineers and stokers deep in the bowels of the ship, the vessel kept shining brightly, like a lone beacon in the middle of nowhere. However, at exactly 2:17 a.m., physics finally beat human sacrifice. The dynamos, operating way beyond their breaking point, began to fail. The yellowish lights that illuminated the despair flickered in a ghostly way. They blinked in a final agonizing breath of power, and then, in the blink of an eye, went out forever. The darkness that swallowed the ocean was absolute, dense, and deeply suffocating. Just think about the devastating psychological impact. You're standing on a deck tilted at nearly 45 degrees, slipping helplessly to your death, and suddenly you are plunged into pitch black. You can't even see the hand in front of your face. You can only hear the terrified wails of over 1,000 souls trapped in the exact same nightmare. And that completely changes the scale of the terror. Because it was exactly under this impenetrable darkness that the final blow struck. The massive steel stern was already raised dozens of feet into the air, exposing the massive bronze propellers against the star-filled, moonless sky. The colossal weight of this gigantic structure hanging out of the water was simply something the hull was never designed to hold. Without any visual warning in the dark, the deathly silence was shattered by a deafening roar. It was a sound so grotesque, metal tearing, heavy steel beams snapping like toothpicks, that survivors in the lifeboats literally had to cover their ears in sheer shock. The unsinkable ship was literally breaking in half. Despair reached its most agonizing peak when the structure finally gave way, and hundreds of people were hurled into the void, plummeting into the unforgiving water. The second they hit the sea, the cruelest reality set in instantly. The water was exactly 28 degrees. The thermal shock was like 1,000 ice daggers piercing the skin all at once. It paralyzed muscles in seconds and literally stole the breath right out of their lungs. In that exact moment, swallowed by the black water, all the arrogance of the Gilded Age sank forever. First class, with its aristocratic titles and untold fortunes, was brutally reduced to the exact same fragility as any other human being, just fighting for their next breath.